Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first in our rebooted seminar series on building capacity for sustainable development. This year, we're grounding the series in global agriculture and food systems, and today's panel focuses on on one of the six capacities that our research shows is important for the pursuit of sustainable development. That is the capacity to promote equity. One of the core research findings from our work in the Capacity Building for Sustainable Development Initiative on equity is pretty simple. It's that inequality is self-reinforcing. The people and organizations that benefit from existing arrangements, from the status quo, from the system working the way it does today, usually like it and push to keep things going that way. In order to make systems more equitable, we have to work against upstream, against the status quo, and that takes a lot of work. So part of what we're doing is looking at experts who we know and leaders have built systems that make agriculture and food system more equitable, and we're asking them to come and talk to us about what their insights are for building the capacity to promote equity that actually sticks. So today I've asked three people to come and talk to us who I know from relationships and experience have really been doing this work for a long time and have, I think, something both very different and interesting to say on the topic of promoting equity in agriculture and food systems. So our three panelists today are starting with Everlyne Nairesiae. Everlyne leads is the African region director for Landesa. Landesa is a global nonprofit that partners with governments and local organizations to secure legal rights for the world's poorest, legal land rights. So she focuses on the land component of equity for the world's poorest families. She is a Kenyan social scientist with nearly 2 decades of experience in land governance and gender equity. Before Landesa, she was at UN Habitat, where she coordinated a global multi-stakeholder effort to get land tenure security indicators into the Sustainable Development Goals monitoring framework. So really looking very closely at this link between equity and measurement. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Everlyne on her perspective on land rights. Then coming to the equity discussion from a really different angle, we have Jess Newman. Jess Newman leads the agriculture and sustainability team at McCain Foods, which I believe is the world's largest manufacturer of frozen potato products. And I think if you eat at McDonald's, you're probably eating some of Jess's potatoes. Her team of agronomists works with potato growers across 5 continents, and I think they have a goal of making most all of their land regenerative by 2030. Before McCain, Jess worked at Anheuser-Busch, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, UNFAO, and in management consulting roles. So we're really interested in her perspective on equity in a large corporate role, but also within the supply chain. And Simon Winter leads a new initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation called Reimagining Humanitarian Nutrition Security, focused on thinking about what is the future of resilient local food systems, especially in fragile regions and especially in this new era of contracting international aid. Before Rockefeller, Simon spent 7 years at the Syngenta Foundation, where I think he just totally expanded their commitment to smallholder farmers within the foundation. And before that, he was at TechnoServe, leading operations in sub-Saharan Africa. And so Simon brings just 3 decades more of experience thinking about how to help smallholder farmers. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of them. We're going to start with just an introduction in their own words after my introduction, talking a little bit about how they come to this issue of equity. And then we'll move into an discussion. Our discussions in this series are often centered on specific examples. So Everlyne, we're going to just, at least for the first part of the round robin, stick in alphabetical order, which is how I introduced you. So I'll start with Everlyne. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. I hope you can hear me well. As you rightly observed, I'm Everlyne Nairesiae. I work for Landesa as the Africa Region Director. My core responsibility is to support the implementation and facilitate the implementation of the Landesa Africa strategy. Our main core business is about land rights, and land rights is our business as our organization, mainly securing the rights of the poor, the marginalized communities. Women rights are at the core of what we do. Social equity and the inclusion really are critical elements of what the work that we do as Landesa, but also looking at the nexus between land and adjacent sectors, for example, agriculture, climate change, and rural development, and other related issues, including degradation or about conservation. All these are critical elements that are intertwined to land rights, are interrelated to land issues, and land play a critical role in advancing those elements. When it comes to food, equity in terms of food systems, land sits at the core, is actually an enabler. Without it, it becomes really complex and difficult to be able to talk about food systems and how security around that can be actually achieved without tenure rights for communities. But allow me just to take it more personal. So I'm an indigenous woman from the Maasai community in Kenya, and growing up, I was able to see and interact directly with the value of land from a food system point of view, from a food security point of view, and how much, access to land was also not necessarily accessible to everybody in the community, especially the women and the girls who were always relegated as, either, a beneficiary or support from their male members of the community in terms of how they would access, or whether they would be able to own, or whether they would be able even to benefit, for example, from the resources like livestock that were actually, graced on the pieces of land. But also importantly is to appreciate that the relationship between land and everybody, particularly the indigenous communities or even the smallholder farmers, go beyond just production. It's a question of identity, it's a question about survival, it's a question about whether or not they are able to benefit from that land in terms of having food. And this is probably, brings us to the question about equity. And I'm looking at equity from a gender perspective when it comes to ownership, access, and control of land, for which Landesa, works to be able to support these efforts towards women benefiting from those resources. But also I'm looking at equity in terms of how communities, for example, the indigenous communities or the smallholder farmers are likely to suffer, either, a discrimination because of the fact that systems have not necessarily been designed, to be able to advance their rights to land. And that limits the opportunity to which they can be able to explore, or to be able to really benefit the issue of, food productivity, or to be able to, contribute effectively and efficiently to the food system that we are talking about. And the gender perspective within these communities, particularly in the rural settings, is also another complex issue that we'll be able to talk about, and how as an organization we've been able to address some of these challenges. Of course, looking at that, we are asking ourselves, if majority of the smallholder farmers or those that are in the agriculture sector nearly half are actually women, who are offering the participation in terms of the workforce, where are they and who owns the land? How are they benefiting, and how can they be able to ensure that they make their contribution effectively to the food systems that we are talking about? So equity in food system cannot be divorced from land. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Everlyne. And so, for the perspective as sort of the very basic of land rights, which I think we probably all agree with, coming in on the corporate side, Jess.
Hey everyone, can you hear me, Alicia?
Yes. Really
yes.
well compared to earlier.
Great. My awesome internet here in Michigan is not working great, so I'm on the phone, but we are making it happen. So I'm really honored to be here on a panel about equity. It's not something I get asked to speak on that often, if ever. So thank you, Alicia. My name's Jess. I lead the ag team at McCain Foods. So as Alicia said, we make a lot of French fries. So our team works directly with growers, so we source directly with them. My teams are spread out across the U.S. and Canada, co-located where our factories are, where our growers are, generally sourcing within 50 to 100 miles of the factories. I've got technical folks on my team, so agronomists, folks who work in variety development, in seed multiplication, in seed agronomy, kind of the whole gamut. So we are integrated in these communities, but work really directly on one specialty crop, which is potatoes. And with those growers directly. So we're working with about 350 growers across the US and Canada in a system that looks in some respects, very different, right, from the one that Everlyne was describing. So, equity isn't the first lens that I generally place on my work or get asked to talk about, not what I would lead with. We know there's some challenge to that language, right? But there are a number of things that I care about both personally and in a work context that I think also advance equity and in general tend to be good business, either from a compliance perspective or helping to address existential threats like climate change. And I've been reflecting a lot on that since reading the paper, one of the papers that helped tee up this seminar series about how kind of to advance equity, you always are fighting uphill against the system. And I think in some cases that's true, but maybe in some cases it's not. So when I think about the things in my world, working with growers in the US and Canadian context, things that are important to our business, but also advance equity, who our team talks to and work with we're on farm, right? There's folks who own farms, there's folks who are like long tenured employees, there's HOA and seasonal labor, whether growers are complying with, child labor or modern slavery laws, which they are, right? But making sure that we understand our role in that, safety culture on the farm. I think we think a lot at McCain around normalizing regenerative ag and advancing soil health and designing programs and equipping our own teams to really be change agents for that. We think a lot about who pays for change and experimentation within a supply chain, which has fundamental questions around equity. I spend a lot of time thinking about grower succession, generational handoffs, and land ownership. To operate a potato farm, you need millions and millions of dollars of equipment alone, right? And it's actually quite difficult to inherit something like that or to pass it on, but that is the bar to operate a specialty crop operation like a potato farm. And so very different challenges around how you ensure that people keep wanting to do this job and that they are able to own the land base that you need to be a potato farmer. I think a lot about what level of consolidation is acceptable, both like morally and also from like a negotiating perspective on our point, right? So how much consolidation do we want or would be good? Is there some inherent value in small-ish family farms? And we think a lot about the talent shift we're seeing in women in agriculture. When you look at like people coming out of agronomy programs now, like they are overwhelmingly women. And so what does that mean? And so we also do a lot of just basic grower performance reviews and data benchmarking to bring each of our individual farm operations what they specifically need to advance, which to some extent is the core of equity, right? What is needed in a situation. And so I think there's a spread of areas where work that just like makes sense to do or addresses threats to the business is also equity work, but it gets done without talking about it that way. And so I think in some of my further examples, I'll talk a lot more about the work that we've done around advancing regenerative agriculture, when we think about kind of intergenerational equity, building and sustaining soil health is very important. And so I'll talk a bit more about some of those programs and examples where we've learned a lot, and I think they've been successful, but it was a really good challenge to just think in general, about how my work intersects with equity. So I'll hand back to Alicia.
Thank you, Jess. I was hoping you would say intergenerational equity because, of course, that's the other part of the equity discussion that we could have here of both how do we promote equity within our generation, particularly for the poorest communities, but also bring generations that are not yet here to have a say to the table. Thank you, Jess. And to you, Simon.
So my current portfolio at Rockefeller Foundation is pretty new. I've been there now about 7.5 months. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm looking at how, in the face of the significant downturn in official development assistance over the last couple of years, which is not predicted to turn around anytime soon, we can use advanced data systems, particularly the rapidly increasing precision of satellite data, survey data, sensors in soils, sensors in water, and so on, to serve multiple use cases, and particularly in highly fragile regions. So the equity dimension of that, of course, is that countries like Somalia, countries like Haiti, the Mindanao part of the Philippines, those three are areas that we're going to be launching pilot programs in. These are, for many development organizations, not the most obvious places to go because they're highly fragile and highly vulnerable anyway. And then within those places, you have the kinds of smallholder farmers that Landesa is also focused on, trying to eke out a living and increasingly getting beaten up by the increasing volatility of weather, as well as risks of conflict breaking out and so on. So the equity dimension is really at the core of what I'm doing. The humanitarian side of it, what is often quite separate from the let's say development side and the climate resilience and adaptation sides of things, is mainly aimed at saving lives. But the data that can inform predictive anticipatory action by humanitarian organizations at its fundamental level is the same information that can guide farmers to improve the diversity of their crops, improve the health of their soils, improve irrigation use, and then along the value chain, other enterprises to lean in and invest in more resilient businesses in the future. So that's the heart of what I'm doing right now. But for much of the last 20 years, 20 plus years, I've been working on smallholder farmers and SMEs in underserved rural communities. And then the question is why. So on the personal side, just a couple of biographical points. I grew up as the son of a son of immigrants in the UK, who in British language we call very working class type immigrant situations. My dad was born in the East End of London at a time where that was a hotbed of poverty and other results of inequality. And my dad and both my parents were dentists, so not an obvious starting point for working in agriculture. But my dad always worked in the public sector. He had a very strong ethical base, and I inherited that from him. Early in my career, I ended up in Côte d'Ivoire and was working for a bank in Abidjan in the mid 80s, and saw some of the ravages of rather poor development planning, and very close and personal. And that was really the moment where I was like, no, equity for me is not just a domestic British situation, having grown up in London, but it's really a global situation. And that was really what set me on my sort of path to trying to find ways to do inclusive development, support people from disadvantaged backgrounds to advance themselves, and particularly economically. I'm an economist by training. That was my sort of starting point. And then just the third sort of biographical point is when I then decided to do a PhD in the mid 90s, looking at how to accelerate economic development in Africa, inclusive economic development. I realized that local small and medium scale enterprises often were isolated from being able to access the kinds of technology and the kind of expertise that would help them improve their competitiveness, help them access finance, help them grow businesses, help them create jobs, and so on. And again, there was a strong equity component to that. And then I, just after completing my PhD, came across TechnoServe, which was an organization that was really trying to tackle these issues through capacity building, through providing technical assistance to those very farmers and entrepreneurs who are typically excluded. I can say more about the work, but I'll pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Everlyne, Jess, and Simon. So you can see that we have sort of this broad, separate set of takes coming from different angles on this question of equity in how to really embed it and change incentives in global food systems. So in this seminar series last year and again this year, I've asked everyone to think about one example of a program or a project, or ideally, hopefully, at least a partially successful case of building equity capacity. And then I've asked everybody to think a little bit about like what it took, what was the work that it took to build and maintain this ability to do it, so that we can go from like this is what we did to like, well, if I was going to tell someone else how to do this, what would be my advice? So we're going to go around. Everybody hopefully has thought a little bit about their example, and we'll do the round robin in the same order. So we'll start with you, Everlyne.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I'll share an example from the work that we have done here in East Africa about securing tenure rights for smallholder farmers. So this is an initiative that is jointly implemented, or a project that is implemented jointly by Landesa and One Acre Fund, with the generous support of Core Impact Foundation that is supporting this particular effort in Kenya and Rwanda. I'll focus more on the Rwanda side of the story, but a bit of maybe some cross-referencing with the Kenya part. So the smallholder farmers, we know very well the role they play in a food systems in terms of production, in terms of making it possible for survival, not just of themselves, but they keep the world running, and their contribution is heavily important. So this particular project was designed from the point of view that first is to appreciate that the land securing tenure rights gives the opportunity or creates an enabling environment and the motivation for the smallholder farmers to really be able to work on their farm, to be able to take decisions, to be able to grow, to be able to participate effectively in the agriculture space. And how did we go about doing this jointly with the One Acre Fund is to appreciate that also partnership is critical in ensuring that we bring our complementary strengths to the table than trying to be an expert in all spaces. So the intention, as I said, is about securing tenure rights for smallholder farmers so that they can be able first to improve productivity, to be able to feed themselves and to be able to feed others. But it's also about strengthening the capacity to access also agriculture services that are offered by government, because without securing tenure rights, it becomes really complex. And when you talk about smallholder farmers, a majority, and in this case in Rwanda, about 72% would actually be smallholder farmers, majority of whom are women. Then we said, apart from that, we also, through tenure security, we are able to improve the capacity to develop on-farm assets. And this will potentially be like trees, will be ability to even plant like high-value crops, because then you have tenure security and you are not threatened. And tenure security for us is not just about the legal title. It's also about perception of your tenure security. If you perceive your land rights to be secure for the next like 5 or 10 years, then you're likely to invest on that land and be able to do more. So we came together to work with the One Acre Fund, with bringing this complementary strength of Landesa as a technocrat on land issues and land governance. But on the other side, also working with One Acre Fund as the expert also in agriculture productivity, access to farm inputs, and the technicalities of production. So combined, those two parts became really critical. But how did we identify that this was actually a need? So we did work closely with the government, particularly the National Land Authority in Rwanda, did community survey to be able to establish that indeed these are the issues on the ground by interacting with the smallholder farmers, looking into the reports that were there developed by the Ministry of Agriculture, and also engage the institution, particularly working on agriculture side, to be able to establish what were the issues. And this enabled us to look at what are the potential intervention areas, what are the entry points. So we talk about securing land rights, you can approach it from many angles. But it became very apparent that despite the work that the government had done on registration in Rwanda, for those who are very familiar, there were still a couple of areas that needs to be looked into. One, there were very new laws that needed to be disseminated to the community so that they are fully aware about their rights. Secondly, there are deep social cultural norms that often also hold women back instead of asserting those rights or demanding those rights, and also looking at the structures that are available for land governance. It was very evident that women will hold back and they will not necessarily assert those rights because of lack of information and awareness. And the structures that are there that are also, though they do include women, still women shied away because they are not fully aware on the roles and responsibility of these structures. We came in to be able to provide that support in terms of awareness and so forth. But also we ask ourselves, for the institutions also, we looked at the institutions and how they coordinate, how do they work together, and whether or not they were sufficiently efficient, or they needed to improve their coordination mechanism. And we went also to look into aspects of building that level of partnership and coordination among institutions that are responsible. And with this kind of design, you are also looking at the systemic change, both at the policy and how the policy are disseminated, how policies are even designed, and whether they are responsive enough. We are looking at the capacity strengthening elements, which we were also able to design around that based on the gaps that we were able to see, but also the strategic partnership I've talked about, and now the opportunity we had with the financing that we got from Core Impact to initiate the project. So for us also, collaborating directly with government is really a core principle that for Landesa. And the reason why we do this is to ensure that we can actually have the government own the work and own the intervention. for reasons that the buck stops with the government. For civil society, for any actors working in these countries, we cannot be there forever. And at the end of the day, it's about contributing and supporting the government to be able to deliver on their objectives by making these resources available, by bringing in the technical expertise, but leveraging the experiences that Landesa as an organization also and individuals that we have from across the world. So we value that systemic change in terms of opportunities to influence policies, to influence strategies, to influence the ways of working. Because by influencing that, then we are able to make, shift practices, shift behaviors, to, the value for collaboration and ensuring that is like a part of an engine. An engine can be good, but if one part is not working well, then it compromises the efficiency of the engine to work. How do we do this? Of course, we work with the Ministry of Environment that actually supports work with the National Land Authority. And also we have also an MOU with the Ministry of Agriculture, also looking at how do we also collaborate with the side of with the food production side. So our work has given us opportunity to look at policy-related issues from a strategic point of view, from a dissemination. We've worked about capacity strengthening, also in terms of coordination for these actors, particularly looking at land administration officers who are responsible for land governance, from the Abunzi, who are also responsible for dispute, and the committees responsible for dispute resolution. We have been able to offer them, awareness and training, refreshing on their roles, not that they don't know their work, but refreshing and giving them the opportunity to connect with other officers that are still working within the same value chain on land administration. We've also been able to look at issues on boundary correction, because as I talked a bit earlier, there were issues that emerged from the earlier registration that took place. But when you talk about securing tenure rights, those rights have to be validated again for some of those that are affected. So we have also been able to go into 3 districts in Eastern Province and given the opportunities to the local community, especially the women smallholder farmers, to register or correct the boundaries and do the first registration. We've sensitized also the communities. We have also been able to integrate gender equity and social awareness, which is not just about, creating that awareness, but providing really the opportunity for them to come forward and be able to really assert their rights, building the agency that is required for them to be able to communicate and drive the demand for those land administration services that are gender responsive, including land dispute resolution. We have been able to reach quite a good number of about 70,000 of the communities, including women who are the majority of the owners of the parcels, that we've been able to correct and to do first registration. And we are very proud because of this opportunity, because it's one thing to say we enjoy tenure security and so forth, but when you have those rights that are documented, these smallholder farmers have been able now to access farm inputs, for example, from 1 acre fund, from the government, because the provision of the UPI, the identification number of a parcel, give them the opportunity to be able to access farm input. By so doing, they are able to improve production because now they have access to fertilizer. They have access to other agricultural services that they were not able to receive. So we are very proud, and what is making this opportunity very interesting and durable is because of the ownership by the government. It's also anchored in terms of laws and strategies that are priority for the government. And even looking at the opportunities, for example, to coordinate and to be able to deliver better is something very important. But this has not also come without challenges. For example, the perception that if you are looking at formalizing tenure rights in the context of whether smallholder farmers or even sometimes indigenous communities, there's a perception that this is actually motivated to be able to have taxes or tax incentives for the government. Sometimes creates the wrong perception, or if not well interpreted, can also be a challenge, or creating probably opening the windows for land grabbing or corruption or such a thing. In addition to that is, of course, the opportunities that are also linked with the deep cultural norms, or the challenges linked to deep cultural norms and traditions, that they don't just disappear for being in those communities for just a year or two. It requires a constant investment and developing these structures in a way that they actually really work to support those communities for prosperity, but also for women agency and capacity to demand those services. So I stop here. I know probably I've gone beyond time, but I hope this brings the example from Rwanda to the fore. Thank you.
It does. I have 2 sort of interrelated follow-up questions, Everlyne. The first is, you've been doing this work at Landesa and before for a long time now. How have you seen the way that your government partners think about land rights changing over time? And then in this specific example you were giving with 1 Acre Fund, I'd love to know about what was the hardest part? What was the part that kind of kept you up at night worrying that it wouldn't work out?
Yeah, thank you. So the governments have been very receptive, and I think this is because of the history of Landesa, where our organization was founded actually from a legal support to government. That was the foundation. And for the longest, our approach is not necessarily just to call attention to the government that here are the gaps, but we work in an accompaniment process that says, hey, this is what we have established. Can we explore the opportunity to collaborate and work together and even explore resources that will be able to fill the gaps? So that has been very, very well received. And for all the countries where we work, the primary ally are the governments. As I said, we do have MOUs for all the countries where we work, collaboration directly with institutions. And I think that has really worked great. In terms of what has kept me or us awake in terms of this project is, particularly looking at the fact that the level of partnership we have with the communities and the sensitivity, of course, that comes with land rights. It's important that we do it right at every level. And that has the opportunity that has saved the situation and ensuring that the speculation that maybe this is a tax related, incentives, and maybe communities will shy away from coming forward to have their properties or their land corrected or rectified, is the collaboration that we've had with the government, the district officials, the local community.
Uh-oh. I think we're losing Everlyne a little bit. So while hopefully her internet will get better, Jess, I'm gonna hand it over to you for your example. I'm sorry, Everlyne.
Directly, and accompanying the.
Okay, that was awesome, Everlyne. Thank you for sharing about that program. So I guess the success story in building the capacity to advance equity that I would share is a specific program that we have with our growers across the US and Canada, which are regenerative ag peer cohorts. I'll give a little bit of context around just McCain's Regen Ag commitments. We have a commitment that 100% of our acres would be 100% regenerative by 2030. If you Google McCain Foods Regen Ag framework, you will see exactly how we measure that by soil health indicator, by 3 different tiers, right? And we basically can collect data and classify all our acreage every year. It's a voluntary program, right? But we have a strong belief that the growers who are advancing in that framework will ultimately be the ones who are most resilient to succeed. One of the core reasons that we have commitments around Regen Ag is because we see climate change as a really existential threat to the potato industry, right? We are a high risk, high input cost specialty crop. And when I look at the cost of crop failures for us, which could be either having to, buy more expensive open market raw or move raw from one region to where there was a crop failure or wasn't a crop failure to one where there was, we're already probably spending $25 or $50 million a year doing that. And so when you talk about, someday climate change is going to be tough for us, it's like, there's no someday, right? Like it's right now. And there's a big price tag and a big imperative to invest in stabilizing yields through variety development, as well as building soil health, right? So when we think about this intergenerational element of equity, right, it's investing in something that sometimes those time scales are pretty long, right? And you may not see the outcome. So that's the context for why we care, why we have our commitments. A lot of our growers are already doing great things to advance on this front, but how could we support and accelerate? So in the US, we have a USDA National Resources Conservation Service grant called an RCPP grant, many acronyms, Regional Conservation Partnership Grant, where basically the way this program works is that in both Wisconsin and Maine, we will have a cohort of 6 growers who apply each year. It's then a 3-year program that they're in across their full rotation. They will be in a peer cohort facilitated by their McCain agronomist and someone from the Soil Health Institute, where they will build their Regen Ag and soil health farm plans together. And then they'll receive cost share from McCain as well as the USDA to then implement certain practices that are covered for cost share. So I like this program a lot because I feel like it addresses all 3 of the barriers to Regen Ag adoption, the technical, social, and financial ones. Not only for growers feeling more confident in building the capacity to trial these practices, but for our own team. I think one of the things that we've seen is a lack of technical assistance for growers who are trying to adopt regenerative or soil health practices. Like our extension system in the US is generally not built around that. And so therefore, like sometimes our team, who's very expert at like traditional potato production, would get nervous about giving advice on what may be seen as more of a regenerative practice. But when you are in a peer cohort facilitated model, nobody has to be the expert, right? You are solving things together. So it's really overcoming that nervousness from my own agronomists and experts, helping them build their confidence. Like we're facilitating finding solutions together versus having someone teach, right? We're all teaching each other. And so I think that model has been really effective. I know it's not only been proven in this example, but in many different interventions in agriculture, that peer cohort model being really important. I think we also learned that it really mattered who the growers were in that group. Every one of our regions have what I would call like the usual suspects, which is the growers who kind of like have already been to the mountaintop on soil health. Like they are the evangelists. And oftentimes they're not the best ambassadors because everyone else is like, yeah, it's that guy again, right? And so what's been interesting about this program is that we would bring in more like what I would say like middle of the pack guys on an S curve of adoption. And in general, we saw the people who were interested were the next generation on the farm. So I would say like the 20 to 40-year-old growers. So there's also that like intergenerational component. And from a sourcing, like strategic sourcing perspective, we really like to have strategic conversations with those growers because someday they're going to inherit the contract, hopefully, right? And sometimes the older generation will hesitate to bring the younger generation into those kind of strategic management discussions. And we found that actually a lot of our regen ag interventions were a way to bring forward the younger voices on the farm and involve them in meaningful management decisions and trials. So I think that, you know, the outcome of this project was really empowering growers, but also our own team members and other technical agronomists in the area with like a different way to facilitate like learning and trying things that ultimately advance soil health. And we didn't have to cost share a lot of those programs. Like it was more about helping growers find the thing they were excited about trying, and then helping them all learn from each other how to do that and do it better and really overcoming those social barriers. And recently I was in, for example, Manitoba for a winter grower event, Manitoba Potato Days. There is nothing like Manitoba in January. And they there was like a panel hosted by the Manitoba Potato Growers Association that was all the growers in our peer cohort there. But it wasn't a McCain event. It was a Potato Growers of Manitoba event, right? And it was each of them sharing what they learned. And so I think for us, like, you know, we've come a long way in our 5-year journey from kind of like teach and lecture and trainings into like, no, it's about this magic that happens when the younger generation comes together about something that they really care about. Yeah, so it's been a really fun program, and it's not like it just like burst out fully formed and functioning, right? Like we learned a lot year over year. I think we're in our 3rd or 4th year of some of these, and the fact that you know, our partners in government in the U.S. saw fit to invest and keep investing in that model, I think speaks to the fact that we're onto something. So that is the example I would share.
Thank you, Jess. That's such a fascinating example. In some ways, you know, it comes out of a little bit of maybe, I don't know, tell me a little bit about how you came to this model for doing things, because that's not usually how you think about corporate tech adoption support. Was there any of it that came out of your time working at the UNFAO or with more developing context? Because it almost has echoes of that.
Yeah, I think for me, it came down to like us really overlaying a change management lens onto a lot of what we do. And there's a lot of changes we try to push through our grower base that are not just about regenerative agriculture. Like anytime you roll out a new variety, like grows it first matters, and the reputation that that variety like gets in the first couple of years matters, and like how you control that narrative, and like how you articulate what's in it for folks, right? And so I think that we just didn't realize we also needed to do that for basically every change. And so some of that comes out of like a social science background that myself and other folks would have on the team. And then I think some of it was just born out of failure, right? Like in the beginning when it was like, well, let's bring in the foremost famous regen ag experts. And they just like really the growers didn't resonate with those folks. And then it was like, okay, that didn't work. So like what's next? So I would say that it was a bit of us having folks with interesting backgrounds so we could toss out some interesting ideas about what to try, but it was also just hitting some walls, and then trying some different approaches. And then, as with anything, like adopting a design thinking approach and like talking to the folks you want to work with and understand like how they want to learn. So in our grower survey every 2 years, we ask our growers how they want to learn, and it's very different. Like some of our regions are like, I don't want to learn from anybody else. Like I'm awesome, right? And some of our regions are like, I love to share, right? And I want to be in like continual connection with so like I think it's also data like that iterative understanding of like what your stakeholders want that also helped us shape it.
Thank you, Jess. All right, Simon.
So my example is back from work we did at Syngenta Foundation, and particularly in India, to help to tackle one of the chronic challenges in underserved rural areas of India, which is that smallholder farmers have trouble accessing and adopting innovations that could be really helpful to their agricultural production. This is not just in India. It just happened that we had a strong driver and leader in India who said, well, they want to help tackle that challenge. And it's not just, the existing smallholder farmers who are often quite elderly. So again, this intergenerational equity issue that Jess was talking about earlier is pretty universal, actually. So, how do you engage youth? And then also there's, this is now going back about 15 years, we still had very strong gender disparity. So how do we get more women advanced and becoming successful as farmers and as adopters of innovations? And the approach that was developed was around developing local young women and young men as agri-entrepreneurs, as change agents for their communities, where they could see themselves staying in their communities. A lot of young people obviously leave rural areas these days, and not only staying in their communities, but having a much better life than their parents by developing multi-sided businesses where they could be, for example, aggregating inputs and offering inputs in the community at a discounted price to community members, providing agronomic advice, aggregating outputs, and helping farmers access improved technologies on the input side, on the mechanization side, and so on. So that was the approach theoretically, and then over many years we developed methodologies to then identify how to select the right people. Not everybody is a natural entrepreneur, and even people who are natural entrepreneurs still need support. They need training, they need mentoring and coaching, they need advice. And so the methodology got refined and refined, the use of digital tools in particular to reduce the costs of the interventions. Got a big kicker through the pandemic, actually, because we couldn't then support in-person support for these entrepreneurs. As of at least a couple of months ago, when I last checked in on the numbers, I think we were talking about something like 26,000 young entrepreneurs actively supported or graduated from the network in India, supporting well over 3 million smallholder farmers. And this approach and methodology has now been encapsulated in a new institution called the Global Agri-Entrepreneurship Academy, which is a partnership between the legacy organizations of Syngenta Foundation, because we had these local nonprofits that decided to reestablish themselves when the company stopped supporting the foundation globally, and the International Finance Corporation and Corteva, the agri-import company. As we developed this, of course, we did not do this on our own. This theme of partnering with other organizations was very important for us, and obviously the primary partners are the young entrepreneurs themselves, and the entrepreneurship model is not always an individual entrepreneur. In some countries, it ends up being more a cooperative-based model. So in West Africa, we were often working, as we tried to apply the model there, we were often working more with cooperatives, for example, rather than family businesses. We needed partnerships with the innovators. Where were the innovations coming from? And often the let's say, A grade innovations that might be appropriate for commercial farmers are just too expensive, unaffordable for smallholders, even with a more organized supply chain. So working with local innovators, local adapters, working with public organizations like the CGIAR and other innovation suppliers was part of the approach. And then even if you have that aggregation on the output market side, I mean, at the village level, those aggregators are still having to sell and try and find the McCains of India or other aggregators who are then the larger buyers. And what's that model? And how do you develop that in a precise way that is low cost and high quality, so the buyers are convinced to engage with non-traditional, let's say, suppliers. And then finally, we needed financing organizations. We needed catalytic financing to set up the program, train the entrepreneurs, mentor the entrepreneurs, and so on. We found it was very important to have the young people themselves invest some of their savings or mobilizing funding from their families and friends to get some skin in the game to create stickiness. But that wasn't enough for them to, for example, be able to set up greenhouses or small trading posts to buy machines if they wanted to offer mechanization services and so on. So creating things like credit scores for these entrepreneurs, again, using digital tools. We worked with Rabobank, for example, to develop credit scoring systems that then enabled financial institutions to have the confidence to provide credit to these entrepreneurs. So really quite a web of diverse stakeholders needed to then be orchestrated in order to have these young dynamic entrepreneurs supported, and then the continuous learning of how do we make sure that we're not wasting their time and our money or other people's money in the process because actually we've got the wrong people selected or they weren't hitting the kind of performance benchmarks. That was a big part of the training, and I think now we're up to well over 80% of the entry level candidates graduating after 2 years as successful entrepreneurs, which is quite distinctive, I think. There were a lot of trade-offs that we encountered as we went through this process. First of all, how do we ensure that the agri-entrepreneurs don't capture all the rents or the profits at the expense of the farmers, and the farmers end up no better off? I mean, this was about the rural transformation program. It wasn't just about setting up entrepreneurs. So helping to align incentives between the entrepreneurs and the farmers and make sure they built trust-based relationships was a big part of the coaching and the mentoring. And also there was a lot of visibility then using digital tools into what the transactions were and where profits were getting distributed along the value chain. I wouldn't say it was perfect all the time, but we spent a lot of time thinking about that equity issue. And a lot of it's about stickiness. Again, if you create benefits for everybody, it's more likely that you're going to leave behind something that is sustainable. Women entrepreneurs versus male entrepreneurs. This was another issue that we had to promote quite heavily. There was a lot, particularly in India, a lot of concern amongst families that allowing their daughters to go off into rural areas on motorbikes, for example, wasn't necessarily safe or attractive. So we had to spend a lot of time developing the right kind of protocols around safety and security for the young women. We often trained them in cohorts of women entrepreneurs together so they could also share and learn from their peers. And by training women together in a safe environment, that would often encourage then the families to support the program. And then once you've done this a few times, you start to share those examples, and then everybody gets to be more confident. I would say another trade-off was around the use of digital technologies, because we're often competing with, in a sense, digital-only players who say, well, we can just offer these digital tools and everything else will sort of, plug into them. And actually, we found in these disadvantaged areas, the human face on the digital, or the phygital, as some people call it, approach actually made a lot of difference versus the digital only. And then perhaps another trade-off was around, how did we move from thinking about this as projects to thinking about it as something that was scalable. And here we got into the idea that as a foundation ourselves, we were not the right people to be carrying this thing to scale. We had to stimulate other actors to be the scaling platforms, and we created two categories of organizations. We created the idea that for the young entrepreneurs themselves to have sustainable businesses post graduation after 18 to 24 months, they needed to have commercial relationships with input suppliers, finance providers, off-takers, and so on. And not every financial institution or every agribusiness is interested in this kind of model. So we did a lot of selection of what we call network manager businesses. And the idea of the network manager is it's a business that sees its business future and its business prosperity through managing a network of rural agents or engaging in a network of rural agents. So again, aligning incentives between the corporates and the entrepreneurs and the farmers was very important. And then at the core of it,
can I jump in there? Which kinds of ag innovation organizations were interested in those types of partnerships?
It's a huge diversity. I mean, one of my favorite network managers is actually in Kenya, Everlyne. It's a mechanization service provider. They own machines, they rent out machines or lease machines. And in order to have those machines utilized productively, they saw this agent model as a very good way of getting those machines adopted by smallholder farmers. In Bangladesh, we worked with several microfinance organizations that wanted to get microfinance more activated in rural areas. And again, saw the value of not just having a loan agent or a cash in, cash out agent purely providing financial services, but linking it strongly to agribusiness opportunities then created stickiness for them with their customer base, a bit like a 1 acre fund type model, if you like. So quite a variety of organizations. And then at the heart of it was the idea that we created as the platform for ongoing change, what we called catalytic intermediaries. So an example of a catalytic intermediary now would be this Global Agri-Entrepreneurship Academy. So the idea of that is not that it's, a grant-seeking platform in perpetuity, but over time, it should earn revenue from its successes by running successful programs. It can then, at the core of itself, become a self-financing, sustainable platform. And that was the idea of the catalytic intermediaries, kind of a social enterprise model, if you like. Maybe the last thing I'll say is also it was very important to think about this the monitoring and evaluation and learning components of this for that continuous improvement, continuous cycling of making sure that the things that we were intending were actually either happening, or if they weren't happening, we were learning and adapting. So I'll just give you one example there. Early on, we got this program activated in areas of India that were too close to big cities. And what would happen is that the young women, the young men would get the training, they would get the mentoring, and then they would go and get a nice job in the city at several multiples of what they could earn as an individual entrepreneur. So this really was a fit for purpose model for underserved rural areas, further away typically from the cities. You needed a different kind of model if you wanted to be closer to the cities. So let me pause there.
No, thank you, Simon. That's really helpful. So I think a little bit for me, at first you said this example was about India, but it sounds like it has also scaled to Bangladesh and Kenya and maybe other areas. So talk a little bit about that scaling process. Did you just copy paste the model? How did you think about we've done a good job here. When we're trying to support another region and doing this, what are the core lessons versus what varies across context?
So there are two steps in that. One was, what did we do when we were still running Syngenta Foundation and we had our network of 7 countries? So there it was knowledge exchange, practice exchange, exchange visits, and so on from other countries, typically to India, to come and learn about the model, take it back, but then do their own homework in their local context to say, for example, how many farmers should one of these entrepreneurs support? In India, it's a hyper-local model. It's typically 100 to 150 farmers is about the sweet spot. But that got then adapted by the local teams in other contexts. In Nigeria, it's really an SME. I mean, the model there was typically a business that would work with 3 or 4,000 farmers and maybe have 8 to 10 employees. That was just what seemed to work in that particular context. So it's a highly adaptive process, even with one institution like us at the core of it. Now, with the Global Agri Entrepreneurship Academy, it's an offer. So we've got this experience, between my former colleagues and the IFC teams that have been running agribusiness leadership programs and other agribusiness capacity building initiatives. Some input from Corteva in terms of how they train their field force and offer, agronomic services and so on. And then that all gets combined into if you like, a toolkit that can then be offered to other organizations. So those other organizations include the government of Bhutan, which says we want to transform our rural areas through entrepreneurship. It's a public-private network in Cambodia run by a local nonprofit. It's actually One Acre Fund in Rwanda, who says we're very good on the agronomy side, but we want to learn more about how to have our field agents run their operations in a more business-like way and help farmers that they're serving, become better business people. So now it's at that sort of second order of scale out where we're basically offering this, and anybody watching this, we would love to hear from you if you're interested, because we think, this is a highly, highly scalable model, and we're continuing to improve it. For example, now bringing AI into the offer as well.
All right. Thank you, Simon. That was really, it's exciting to see a scalable way of thinking about unlocking business in these very hard to reach communities. And I especially find the insight that, if you're just helping people, and so often I've, in my own work, development organizations are focused on the village that's closest to the side of the highway where they can get their people to easily and do their demonstration project. And those aren't the people that need the most help, and where there's many alternate off-farm opportunities for youth. It's places that are really hard to get to. So it's exciting to have a model that it works best if it is actually the hardest place to reach. So we're going to turn one more round robin to a little bit more generalizable, or maybe not generalizable, but a discussion of sort of what it is, the things that you're worried about in this space of promoting equity, Everlyne, within land rights in sub-Saharan Africa, or what you want to think about. Jess, I'd love you to think a little bit about equity for future generations in big ag, in corporate ag. And Simon, maybe at this point you could turn a little bit to how you're thinking about equity in the context of decreasing aid, unless you had a different topic for this round. So Everlyne, I'll start again with you. What is challenging and keeping you up at night?
Yeah, so I know our efforts are focused on securing land rights for women, for local communities, and looking at equity from that point of view. Sorry, I think something touched my screen.
You sound great.
Okay, great. So, however, we've just barely scratched the surface. I think the fact that almost about 75% of land in Africa is yet to be documented or even registered. So it's totally outside the cadastre system. Both for the indigenous community, probably constitute a majority of the land managed and governed under customary tenure. I think it's a challenge that we must be able to deal with in one way or another. The other challenge that we need probably to focus on a little bit more is the pressure that comes with the need for large-scale land-based investment, and in situations where these rights are not secured. How do you play around with that to ensure that, and maybe this also speaks to what Simon has talked about and what just spoke about. These rights have to be secured for this kind of investment to be really, minimize the risks, for example. And I'm just thinking about how even such models can actually thrive in places where these rights are not secured. And it's not just about the benefit on the part of the investor, but it's also the benefit for the communities and for the women, which in this case, having these kind of models and investment could easily deepen inequality. And we are keen, therefore, to ask, how do you ensure that this equitable, investment that really respects the rights of this community from a land rights point of view, but also from benefit sharing and so forth, that are benefits that are accrued directly from their investment or the investment on the land. I think that's also equally another point that is really important, but equally challenging as we think about all these aspects. The other point that we need to think about is the issue of degradation and climate change, and the impact and the nexus between land tenure rights in terms of opportunities to advance, reducing, land degradation, but also climate related risks. I think for the longest, we have actually divorced totally what is the implication of, land rights in terms of advancing opportunities to really, address climate change, building resilience to climate change, and also degradation part. I think it's for us to be able to look at this as an opportunity that also has a bearing on the equity aspects, either from opportunities or whether this will also be linked to disputes and also, like the fighting for the scarce resources that are there, that are linked to whether you own the land or someone else is on the land or the forest or access to water, are also issues that, already call attention to the extent to which this will have a bearing on the food system from an equity point of view. There's a question about technology, and I know someone also talked about it. Technology is good, but also there are risks that are associated with technology, particularly when working with rural communities that often do not have the opportunity, for example, to benefit directly or to have access to those technological inventions. I'm happy to hear that there are those practices that have worked, and I know a couple of our efforts have also integrated a bit of technology, but also there is a opportunity to be able to apply those, but equally is a challenge in one or another in a situation where they may be at risk of leaving women behind, particularly where those rights are not secured and therefore they will not be able to apply the opportunity to use the technology either in terms of mechanization or whatever that are tools that they can actually be able to do the work. The last point that I would probably also talk about is the issue of financing. For women, smallholder farmers, for example, and pastoralists or indigenous communities, in terms of the food system-led solutions that actually owned, including aspects, for example, on insurance or issues that, for example, giving them the resources in form of credit and opportunities that actually, embed themselves on their realities on the ground, which I think is a challenge to the extent to the fact that, as I said, if they don't have the land rights, it becomes really complex. Those who are investing will find them highly insecure to be able to put the resources there and therefore leaving them also vulnerable. So for us, land rights are really at the core of making really the food system really work. And we must be able to use use land rights as an opportunity and an enabler to be able to achieve the other things that we've talked about. So let me leave it at that point for now, Alicia.
Thank you, Everlyne. Jess.
Yeah, I think I'm muting myself in the wrong place. So I think that the challenges that keep me up or not at night, the things I think a lot about from an equity perspective are just like the state of the U.S. farm economy right now. Like there are very few bright spots, right? Unless you're, in the beef industry. There's significant uncertainty with tariffs and trade flows. Everything is down, right? And so I think a lot about consolidation, who owns land, how land ownership is increasingly moving away from growers to being back consolidated into pension funds and other third-party purchasers. And so I think a lot about that from two angles. One is is from an equity perspective about, how do we ensure that there are farmers who care about soil health in the future, who have the dignity of owning their own land, who then have the incentive to invest in soil health because they own their own land, right, and control the full rotation, but also from like a sourcing and supply chain perspective, right? About like, well, are there going to be enough potato acres in 10 years? Are people going to want to do this? And so, I think a lot about how we create the incentives to invest in soil health when our growers increasingly don't own their own ground. So about 50% of my contract acres in the US and Canada are rented today.
Wow.
And that number is increasing. And now a lot of those are like 10-year lease, like the dream lease, right? Like a 10-year lease, it's you're leasing it from your neighbors, like who've been there forever, but like that's not certain, right? And all it takes is the next generation saying, liquidate that. Like we want the money, right? Which I don't blame them sometimes. And so there's risk there. And so I think, I think a lot about how we create how we as a buyer can help create the capacity for successful and conditions for successful succession events to occur, passing off of these very large farms, and building the capacity of folks to invest in soil health. Because I mean, I do believe that the growers who are investing there are going to have an advantage. And then I think the other thing that maybe it doesn't keep me up at night, but excites me about the future is I do believe with satellite monitoring and AI that we are reaching a point where we will be able to actually show that there is a risk reduction from investing in soil health. And that unlocks and aligns all kinds of incentives in the banking and insurance sectors that right now, if a bank is giving money towards regen ag and sustainability, it's philanthropy, right? At the end of the day, it's not an investment that they expect a differentiated return for. And so I think a lot about how we reach a point where growers can get preferential insurance or access to capital or different kinds of loans because of the way that they've been farming, and that's really easy to prove. And I think we're still a ways away, but like we're getting closer. And so I think about mechanisms like that and how they can kind of counteract what I see as this slide into like pretty extreme consolidation coming in like a very large in a U.S. and Canadian context. So I'm worried, but also hopeful.
Thank you, Jess. Simon.
Well, just a comment on Jess's point about insurance. I mean, that's a big issue in the developing world as well as in the US. And also at Syngenta Foundation, we supported a lot of work on weather index insurance solutions for smallholder farmers. And, there's plenty of proof now that you can have these methods work. They can actually help to transfer risk away from the farms. And as Jess is saying, the more you can improve soil health, for example, and farm resilience, the lower the risk is. What we have not seen in the developing world, as far as I'm aware of, is any lenders who are recognizing that risk reduction and saying we'll, reduce our risk premium on our loan rates because there's, this kind of cascade of other things that are actually reducing production risk on the farms, which is shameful, actually, that, the financial institutions are not doing that because there's enough evidence to convince them that, there should be, pathways to that. So that's definitely a challenge that still exists and one we would love to see changed. In terms of things that I'm concerned about, particularly in my new portfolio, but it also relates to the example I gave, I think the diversity and complexity of communicating clearly in today's environment means that even if you do have successful examples, trying to get large numbers of stakeholders to pay attention to them and not getting distracted by other aspects of the news cycle or the social media cycle and so on, that's a huge challenge. Is just how do we, bring attention to things that are working versus things that are not working. And I think particularly in this age now of diminished, obviously, official development assistance, diminished aid financing, it's even more important that we're able to identify the things which are good, have good return on investment for the less, money that is now available. And then there's particular types of money that I think are particularly scarce. So I think there's a lot of evidence of what scalability and successful scaling methodologies or increasingly successful scaling methodologies look like. We just closed last week the Scaling Community of Practices annual forum. There were 11 different sessions run on different types of scaling methodologies. And that community of practice is running a campaign now to try and get funders and other development actors to look seriously at these lessons that are emerging around, success and emerging successes around scaling. So I think there is optimism there that this could happen, and at the same time, pessimism that the type of money that is required to unlock that sort of knowledge and get it applied, what I would call sort of meta-level financing, is increasingly scarce as ODA is shrinking. There are new institutions coming in, or others that are growing. I mean, well, we'll see what happens in the Middle East now, but there is an increasing array of interest, I think, amongst Middle Eastern actors to get into global development issues and global resilience issues. Southeast Asia, Far East, I think, increasing, much as Europe and North America is declining. So I think there are new sources, but at the same time, the challenges are increasing from the changing climate and increasing risks of conflict and so on. So we're which is going to rise faster, very unclear at this point. And then finally, I think I worry about AI as well. I think AI is a huge opportunity for the acceleration of learning and the application of learning, whether it's machine learning type AI applications or large language models and so on. And organizations like Digital Green certainly are, on the front line of offering AI guided farmer advisory services, for example, with great success, as I understand it, at least in some cohorts. But at the same time, I think there's a correlation between the type of information that you need to feed into the machines or the large language models and where poverty is. So the amount of digitized data that sits in the kind of vulnerable and fragile situations I'm focusing on now is massively less than in large-scale commercial farming communities, for example. So how do the AIs learn reliably? How do they develop high trust-based, high credibility-based advisory systems if they're not being fed properly with good data and good information? So I think there's risks there. Alicia, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Simon. I was saying yes, especially when you think about agricultural solutions being often so deeply local. I have a hard time imagining exactly how LLMs trained on data produced in often places where there's much more information available is going to help in very hard to reach places. Anyways, well, thank you so much. I did have one more round robin planned, but we're getting right to the end of our time where we would all say something that we learned today. And I do want to try to do it, but it has to be a very quick one sentence, something interesting that you learned today, maybe that you didn't know or that you'll take with you. And then we'll let everybody go. So Everlyne, anything that you learned today from your co-panelists that you didn't already know?
I think I found it very interesting about what Jess shared about the investment in the US and the communities that she's working with. I was interested to hear how that is playing out in Africa, but I think also the examples that Simon has shared brings it closer. And I think the biggest question probably I leave with is how are we integrating tenure rights? And I think already from some of the points that have been mentioned, there's intention probably to be able to do more, but I think the lessons that I'm picking here is that, nobody can do it by themselves. And of course, working directly with the communities at the heart of our intervention is really important, but also they are looking at how best do we have those interventions that are scalable and sustainable. I think that's the much I would say for now. Thanks, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Everlyne, for joining us. Jess?
I think I'll go next. So I think that I learned a ton from both Simon, who I haven't seen in a very long time, and Everlyne. I think my main takeaway was I just love learning about how Landesa operated with collaborating with government from the beginning, and that maybe you go slower to do that, but ultimately you have more capacity in the longer term because you've embedded the power structure. So I really enjoyed hearing and learning about some of those programs and just how Landesa operates as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and from my side, I actually want to synthesize a little bit between Everlyne and Jess, because I think what Jess was talking about the importance of continuous investment in improving soil health is linked to the issue of land titling, because farmers who want to do that, they need to have confidence that they have secure land rights into the future. And if we can really create that nexus and then get that transition properly financially supported, both through smart subsidies, but also on the more commercial side, I think we can manage the required transitions to create much more resilient farms for the future. But it's going to, as both other panelists have said, it's going to require a lot of actors coming together in unusual ways in order to do that. But I think that's the path we need to go.
Yeah, I was also surprised in the end, actually, how much overlap there was between the challenges, Jess, you're facing here in the U.S. and the core challenges of land rights in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That in many ways, how do we pass on those land rights to make sure that agriculture continues, whether that's for very small farmers, but also for keeping people in agriculture in the U.S. That was, I did not expect that from today. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. Our next panel is coming up on April 9th, and there we're going to be talking about the capacity to measure progress in agriculture and food systems. And we have a really stellar lineup, an all-woman panel this time, coming from different parts of the measurement question, whether it's measuring nutrition security or measuring soil health or measuring access to land. So it'll be an interesting panel. And for those of you here, if you go to our website soon, or we'll probably follow up with an email, please join us. All right. Thank you, Everlyne, Jess, and Simon. It was really great to have you with us today. Thanks, guys.